Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today with Professor Andrew Marsh on a recently published book with Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi called On Muslim Democracy. So it's an excellent book. I urge you to read it. I think it's fascinating. As you all know, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi is not only the elected president of the parliament in the last election, in the last free and fair elections that Tunisia had in 2019. He was elected as a member, and then he was elected by his peers as president of the parliament. He's now languishing in jail, unfortunately, after the coup of 2021 on fabricated charges. Several charges, but all of them are really nonsense and without any proof or any evidence. He is also one of the main Muslim thinkers, I think, at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, especially on the topic of Islam and democracy and the compatibility between Islam and democracy. Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi has written over 20 books on this topic. Several of these books have been translated in several languages, not only English, but many other languages as well, in Urdu and Turkish and Malay and so many other languages. So he is really one of the main thinkers in the Muslim world today on this question of the compatibility between Islam and democracy. We have a pleasure of today to discuss his most recent book with Professor Andrew Marsh. Andrew Marsh is a professor at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Professor Marsh also has written several books on compatibility of Islam and democracy and Islamic political thought. They are also very, very, excellent and timely books. And then we will have the pleasure of hearing three discussants. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He too has written several books on this topic, and maybe he can mention some of them, or I can mention some of them, but they are excellent books. Mustafa is originally from Turkey. He lives in Washington for the last several years, but has written several books on this topic of compatibility between Islam and freedom, Islam and liberty, Islam and democracy, all these things. Monica Marks is also professor at University of New York in Abu Dhabi. She is an expert on Tunisia, but more broadly on Islamic political thought, Islamism, Islamic movements in Tunisia, in Turkey, and several other countries. And then Radwan Ziyada himself is an author. He has written several books also on this topic. So really, it's a very powerful panel that we have today. I'm glad that we were able to get all of you together in this webinar. But let's start with Professor Andrew Marsh. Andrew, please tell us in about 20 minutes the main ideas of this book, why you wrote this book, and what are the main conclusions.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Radwan, for organizing this. Thank you for all of my colleagues for joining and dedicating your time to discussing this book. I am very excited to hear what people have to say. Let me actually spend some time sharing a PowerPoint to help guide some of this. Let's see here. Am I allowed to share my screen on this?
Yes, there is a button at the bottom, share screen.
Yep, share screen. Okay. So here's the book. And it's a little bit unique in the sense that really Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi is the author of most of this book. You'll see that the book consists of 10 essays by Sheikh Rashid, translated into English for the first time. It also includes a somewhat lengthy introduction by me, which deals with the question of what is novel about the idea of Muslim democracy? So as many of the guests and participants will know, the concept of Muslim democracy has been around for quite a long time. The AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s branded itself as not an Islamist party or as aspiring to an Islamic state, but as a Muslim democratic party. Parties in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and elsewhere have been associated with this idea. And so the concept of Muslim democracy invokes or evokes a lot of different associations. One, the most obvious, is the idea of Christian democracy in Europe. And when you understand it in that context, you get the sense that the label Muslim democracy is a kind of party political branding meant to say, we are not anti-systemic. We are not aiming at a kind of authoritarian state in which Islamist parties monopolize all power. We are a party that's committed to democratic pluralism, and you should see us like you see Christian democratic parties throughout Europe. Parties that have a kind of socially conservative base, but are flexible on issues of economics and are fundamentally committed to the idea of constitutional rule. So therefore, don't be scared of us and please don't repress us. So that's one way of framing it. And there have been thinkers like Sayyid Vali Nasr or Asif Bayat, who have emphasized this idea that Muslim democracy should not be seen in ideological terms, that it's a kind of post-ideological phase of the Islamist movement, post-ideological or even post-Islamist, that Islamist parties are no longer committed to their own distinct conception of the state, their own distinct conception of the political, their own distinct conception of constitutions, justice, law, so on and so forth, but are fundamentally pragmatic with regards to the political system in which they find themselves and focus more on electoral competition, good governance, and bringing into the electoral fold certain kinds of socially conservative segments of the population that may have been excluded. So that's the kind of background framing and association that a lot of scholars and journalists and observers have. Now, in the Tunisian context, everybody will be familiar with the well-known declaration at the 2016 Party Congress of the Ennahda Party, in which they declared to no longer be a part of political Islam and to have embraced something called Muslim democracy. Now, one way of understanding this is precisely the way that I just elaborated, that this is Ennahda being pragmatic. It's trying to achieve recognition both by outside powers like European and international powers, as well as local domestic competitors, that we are not a radical party. We are not aiming to monopolize political power. We're not aiming at an Islamic state. And it's also could also be understood as sort of acknowledging political reality. After the 2011 revolution, there was a lengthy 2.5 or 3 year constituent period in which all of the parties to the Constituent Assembly drafted a new constitution that was ultimately adopted in 2014. And this constitution, while it included certain kinds of provisions like the religion of the state is Islam and the president has to be Muslim, had no reference to the Islamic Sharia, did not refer to the state as an Islamic state. It referred to the nature of the state as a republic. And the Constitution, in any fair reading, is a fairly secular form of rule. So the other way of understanding this is that unlike in authoritarian transitions, for example, in the long transition in Turkey, perhaps Mustafa can speak more authoritatively about this, there was never a single revolution. There was never a break with the old order. There was never a single constituent moment. There was never a democratic period in which at once the new state was created. This happened over a long period of time through various kinds of points of negotiation and conflict between the AKP and the Kemal state. In the case of Tunisia, what's significant is that you had the Islamist party, or perhaps multiple Islamist parties, if you consider Tayar al-Mahabba to be in this category, actually participating in a completely open and free democratic transition in which they were the co-authors of what has to be regarded as a secular constitution. So the other way of understanding this declaration that we are now a Muslim Democratic Party is as a recognition of reality, that Ennahda was a party that had participated with other political parties in creating a new political order. Some of them in the early period, the so-called revolutionary parties, but after the crisis year of 2013 and 14, engaging in political cooperation with the party that represented the interests or the personnel of the ancien regime. And so this was sort of a pragmatic recognition of the electoral strategy and attitude of Ennahda. So that's all very well and good, but then we have some questions. What does this mean for a movement and a party, and particularly a leader like Ghannouchi, that was traditionally distinguished by its ideological orientation? And so historically, Islamism cannot be reduced to any particular class, interest, or orientation. It cannot be reduced to any particular ethnic orientation. It cannot usually be reduced to geographic or urban rural distinctions. All of these factor in various countries, but Islamism makes no sense except as a grand idea, as an ideological stance towards law, constitutionalism, forms of rule, modernity, economics, so on and so forth. So there is this question. What is Muslim democracy as an ideology? What is Muslim about it? What is democratic about it? And how is Muslim democracy to be understood or compared to previous iterations of Islamist ideology? So we've discussed in this platform before the translation of Sheikh Rashid's Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which we discussed as representation of his views today. But in reality, there's a very, very large break between the views articulated in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which calls for a state that is democratic, which calls for a state that guarantees public liberties and rights, which calls for a state that is in many cases tolerant of not only non-Muslims in the religious sense, but of non-Islamic political agendas and ideologies, but nonetheless builds the conception of politics around a fundamental assumption of moral unity within the polity. Public Freedoms in the Islamic State assumes that the vast majority of a people, whether it's understood specifically as related to Tunisia or Morocco or Jordan or whatever, or just in general, how Islam imagines politics, it assumes a people, the vast majority of which shares a moral unity around the truth of Islam, around the desirability of Islam, around the emancipatory potential of Islam and Islamic law, and imagines a way in which this people, a pious people, a praying people, a religious people, a people that sees itself as God's Khalifa or Caliph on earth, can govern itself democratically, not governed by military rulers, not governed by kings, and not governed by scholars, can govern itself democratically, but also piously. That is very different from the assumptions about politics that go into the defense and explanation of the post-2014 Tunisian political constitution. That is a political order in which all of those assumptions are replaced. Instead, the basic assumptions of politics are radical pluralism. Tunisia is constituted politically, and not only because of authoritarian restraints, but when you let the people vote democratically, by radical secularists, by communists, by radical Salafis, by feminists, by neoliberal business elites, by people that are hostile to the idea of Islam in the public sphere. That is the foundation of politics. So Muslim democracy, not only at the pragmatic or party political level, but also at the intellectual, moral, and religious level, is fundamentally a response to that fact, that you do not begin with a grand assumption that we are all here basically Muslims. And so that's what's interesting. That's what's interesting about the turn to Muslim democracy, because it's a turn from what political theorists sometimes call ideal theory. What is justice or legitimacy for the world as it ought to be, versus non-ideal theory? What is an acceptable mode of politics for the world as we find it? So that's what I was interested in. And I'm probably down to a few minutes. So let me walk through the book and then say a few things about my own observations and conclusions. So the first is a fairly lengthy introduction by me, in which I discuss Sheikh Rashid's career, and this transition from what I call Islamic democracy as represented in public freedoms in the Islamic State to Muslim democracy as represented in a number of other essays, not only published after 2011, but particularly after that period. Then, in collaboration with Sheikh Rashid, we identified some of the most important essays to translate. Some of these occur before 2011. So a number of them are about the concept of freedom, basic freedoms in Islam, freedom first. And these are very important and I would say sophisticated essays that I think political theorists should be very interested in, because they discuss the different ways in which Islam grapples with the conception of freedom. We're all familiar with the traditional utopian Islamist conception in which Islam is freedom because Islam liberates you from your desires, from your whims, from a secular society, from things that are against Islam. And the Sharia liberates you through the realization of your higher self and your higher purpose. That is still there. But Sheikh Rashid also considers the ways in which basic negative freedom or liberal freedom or legal freedoms also have a religious value in Islam. The freedom not only to be your best pious self, but the freedom to choose or not to choose religious obligations. The freedom to be free from authoritarian domination. The freedom to be free from fear of the state. So these are very sophisticated essays in which lots of the things that we identify with neither secular authoritarianism nor the Islamic utopian ideal of perfection are given a kind of religious valence. Sheikh Rashid also talks about, exactly as the second essay implies, the dialectic of unity, difference, and political pluralism. One of the commonalities of Islamic political thought throughout the 20th century is this assumption that the people are actually religious. Any disagreement or difference or radical pluralism or secularism is an aberration. It's imposed by colonialism, it's imposed by imperialism, or it's imposed by secular elites. So you don't have to think about questions like, what if the people actually desire things other than Islam? And so he's grappling in a very sophisticated way with how Islamic political thought is committed to various kinds of unity, but has to take seriously facts of difference in political pluralism. an essay that I am very excited about between Sayyid Qutb and Malik Benebi. Those that are not as deeply into Islamic political thought or don't read Arabic as well may have heard of Sayyid Qutb and may think that, well, Islamists are all fundamentally inspired by Qutb and Maududi and those kinds of thoughts. And that's not a lie. If you read Political Freedoms in the Islamic State, Sheikh Rashid takes very seriously Sayyid Qutb. He takes very seriously Abul Ala Maududi from India and Pakistan. But he also talks about how the Algerian historian and theorist of civilization Malik Benebi was a formative influence on him from an early period. And so how to think about Islamic political thought between these two very different thinkers is a fascinating essay. And in fact, close readers of Islamic political thought may remember that Qutb himself disparages and dismisses Benebi, not by name. He refers to an Algerian theorist of civilization. And so Ghannouchi, as one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, late 20th, early 21st century theorist of Islam and politics, navigating these two thinkers is a very, very important statement. In Islam and Citizenship, he again talks about the value of deep pluralism and how certain kinds of classical assumptions about citizenship versus dhimma, or the way in which membership in the demos or is fundamentally the same as membership in the ummah, that to be a member of the Islamic community is to be a member of the political community. And so grappling with these facts of difference is something that he's been thinking about well before 2011. The last three essays are very important, very influential. And chapter 8 was actually published in translation earlier by CSID, and with kind permission, we republished it. I edited the translation a little bit, but the last three are really great because these are the main places, in my experience, where Ghannouchi addresses the post-2014 constitution. All of their differences from a classical Islamic conception. And he's very clear. There's no mention of Sharia. There's all that business about how to talk about gender relations, whether it's equality or complementarity. What does it mean to say that Western human rights are universal? And he addresses these things, and he addresses the fact that there were some serious compromises made about language and substance in the Constitution, but how that's justified. And so I think that together, all of these essays are going to give a good sense of what is Muslim democracy as a distinct way of thinking about politics, thinking about political communities, thinking about law, thinking about democracy. And then most of the book is actually a lengthy dialogue between Sheikh Rashid and myself that occurred over about a week in his home, in which I, as an admirer and close reader of his writings, had the opportunity to spend time discussing his ideas, discussing his intellectual formulation, reading out loud together passages from his various works and discussing them philosophically, but also pressing him on some of these issues related to pluralism, the meaning of democracy, continuity between previous conceptions of Islamic thought, and his present views. So I hope it's very difficult to summarize this, but I hope that lots of people will read it and gain from it and feel that some aspects of his thinking were moved along by this. I want to conclude by, that's us chit-chatting. I want to conclude by answering the question that I began with, which is, what is Muslim about Muslim democracy? So in this slide, you have a pretty clear distinction between the 2 points of view. And you'll see what's interesting is that these views were published very close together. So it's not like there's the Ghannouchi of the 80s and 90s that's committed to an Islamic state, and then there's the Ghannouchi of the 2000s that is moderated. there's a lot of overlap between these views. But if you look at these two different quotes, you see that there is this long-standing view that the Islamic State is anti-authoritarian because it upholds the rule of law, but that law is the Islamic law, because the Islamic law is not human. It's not arbitrary. It's objective. It's separate from political interests. And it's not given by the state and by rulers, and that's what gives it its authority. But then, not much later, you'll see this question that, well, in Islam, there's no church. There's no authority that can tell people what Islam is and what does it mean to have an Arab Islamic identity. And so that can only ever be determined by the people, but not by some idealized people, but the actual people that exist and are governing themselves. And so, in my view, there are 5 kind of particular features of the ideology of Muslim democracy. The first is that politics is a kind of social contract. It's not seen as just a contract between the ummah and God. It's a contract between people that are governing themselves. And the subject of that contract is not the akhirah, not the next life, not moral perfection, but our worldly goods and interests that we have in common. Second is that the recognition of the fact of pluralism. Politics is constituted by this radical disagreement. And it makes no sense to wish that the disagreement were different. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if the only disagreement were between Muslims, Jews, and Christians? Because that's the way the classical fiqh tradition talks about it. No, the actual pluralism of a society gives you the contours of politics, and that's what you need to deal with. Third, the purpose of politics is to avoid more evil things. Politics is not about perfection. It's not about becoming God's caliph on earth. It's not about destroying Jahiliyyah. It's not about destroying kufr. Politics is about avoiding the evils of dictatorship and authoritarianism and the lack of democracy. And the way to do that is through agreement and consensus. And so all politics has a conception of friends and enemies or self and other. But in this conception, the friends and enemies are not just determined in terms of religious identification, but where do you stand on democracy? If you're committed to democracy, for us as well as for yourself, even if you're secular, you can be a friend in that sense. But if you're opposed to democracy, whether you're secular or regard yourself as religious, that puts you on the other side of our antagonism. Fourth, there are some very interesting statements about what the Islamic Sharia is. In public freedoms in the Islamic State, it's very complicated, but Sheikh Rashid takes seriously the textual tradition, the text of Islam, the tradition of interpretation, and the need to think about what is the most pious way of formulating law. In some of his statements after 2014, Sharia is just limited government. Whatever limits authoritarianism, that is Sharia. Now, you might ask, what is Islamic about all this? Or what is Muslim about all of this? And the answer is Medina. The single most common justification for this kind of politics based on pluralism, based on a focus on worldly goods, is the Covenant of Medina. And in that interpretation, Medina was a pluralist state. There were Muslims and non-Muslims. It was created not on the basis of divine command, but on the basis of agreement, covenant, contract between tribes and parties. And the object of the agreement was worldly goods and interests. And so Sheikh Rashid says that a number of points. We Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. So we have this model for seeing politics as a matter of contract between people that disagree about religion over shared worldly interests. And the message there is kind of, if it's good enough for the prophet, it's good enough for us. I'm going to end here. I have a number of ways of interpreting how do we think about Muslim democracy as an ideology. Maybe we can come back to that. But I think I'd like to stop here and then hear what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for an excellent summary and presentation. There is a lot to discuss and digest, but I think you really summarized the book very well. Let's go to the three discussants that we have chosen today to discuss this book, and each one will have about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes to give us your opinion. I hope you have had a chance to read the book and perhaps ask one or two questions at the end after you give us your own views of the book and of Sheikh Rashid's ideas in the book. Mustafa, we start with you. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Radwan, for organizing this event and for Andrew for writing this really impressive book. I went through this week, so I found a lot of interesting points, and I'll come to that. But first, I should say that Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi is really, for me, one of the intellectual pioneers, of my own thought. In my 20s, when I was really young and more hardline, I can say, I had read Sayyid Qutb, Yoldaki İşaretler, or the signposts, and as many young, Muslims who are into Islamic, worldview did those days. And Sayyid Qutb was very influential in Turkey. But then came Rashid Ghannouchi. We learned about him in Turkey. His book, actually, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, was translated into Turkish later, and I was deeply impressed by that. Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi certainly represents as Andrew explained, a much more developed, evolved, or progressed, if you will, whatever you call, thinking in terms of this modern political Islamic thought. On the one hand, there's Sayyid Qutb and Mawdudi, who want an Islamic state, the Sharia governed by that. And of course, there is a big emphasis on that these authoritarian rulers, secular dictators especially, are not legitimate. So there's the laws about the ruler. So that's really an important, actually, idea in classical Islam, value in classical Islam. It's there. But also then the Sharia itself come with certain impositions, right? And by modern standards. So how do you deal with that? Now, in this book, I realized that, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi has taken really even more steps, in his thinking. And I think it should be noticed by people who think about Islam and politics. And Andrew already mentioned some of them, but I would say a few more things. For example, he notes that he reminds that there are some Islamists who think democracy is kufr, right? It's the system of the infidels. That's a hardline view. And he thinks, obviously, it's wrong. He compares to the views of Khawarij, even that, saying that gods should rule, but who rules in the name of God? Ultimately, nobody rules in the name of God. So what we need is consultation among the believers, not just believers, but all citizens. So he just gets away from this and shows how it's wrong to just use the idea of divine sovereignty to negate democracy, right? There's this imagined tension between divine sovereignty and the sovereignty of the people. Divine sovereignty is a cosmic, metaphysical concept, but people are, as vicegerents of God on earth, have reason and interests and valuable and values which can be legitimately managed by shura consultation. So that's a very important point. Another thing I really found important was he, as Andrew said, he emphasizes Sharia as one expression of the broader eternal idea of justice. In one place, he says, for example, wherever there is justice, God's law is in force. Now, this is different from the typical Islamist thinking, which is wherever there is Sharia, that is justice. No, he says, no, wherever there is justice, that would be God's law. So which means there can be justice outside of Islam. And he actually emphasizes that. He says Western liberal democracies despite their foreign policies, which we often criticize, rightly so, especially these days. But, they might have rule of law and freedoms that we Muslims, that's why he says Muslims come to these places. And he, notes that Muslims, migrated to the West for freedoms, which he himself, of course, is an example. So I think that's also important. Another place is that he even emphasizes the convergence of the intentions, the maqasid of the Sharia, Islamic law, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. And again, that's different from Maududi, for example, who thought there should be an Islamic version of human rights, different from the UDHR, and the Islamic version only comes from the Sharia, and it doesn't have some of the things that the UDHR would include, such as the right to change your religion or equality for women and genders and all religious groups. So there are really interesting divergences from classical thought, and I think it should be emphasized. Now, one tension still remains, and I think Andrew highlighted that nicely in the discussions with Sheikh Ghannouchi towards the end. And there is this idea of the Sharia, Islamic law, being a liberating force. And on the other hand, you want to bring Sharia. One thing is that, is the Sharia a liberating force? I think in terms of limiting the ruler, yes, we've seen that throughout Islamic history. Rulers could not overtax populations thanks to the Sharia, for example. Rulers could not confiscate Afkaf, the foundations, and so on and so forth. But also there are many aspects of the Sharia that will be liberating only if you believe in it. And if it was imposed onto you, if you were not willing to do that, imagine, like, for example, 5-day prayers, that's a part of the Sharia. It would be a liberating force for you if you willingly, follow these practices of Islam. But if it's imposed on you through a state, it would be an oppressive system of law. Now, here his emphasis on freedom is significant. He emphasizes again and again that Islamic laws, the requirements of Islam should be based on free choice and not by coercion. But also he speaks about still democracy somehow through constitutional courts, the Sharia being involved in the system, in the political system. Now, that is, I think, the next step that we should discuss in Islamic thought. But I do see the direction towards that in this book. For example, towards the end, Sheikh Ghannouchi criticizes ideological states, Dawla Aqadiyya, as if I'm not getting it wrong, the confessional state. And of course, he mentions examples like communist states or even French secularism, which wants to liberate people from religion with its own convictions. But he says Muslims don't have to do that. And he emphasizes the blessings of a neutral state. At least he sees the blessings for that. And that's why towards the end of the book, which I found very significant, he positively mentions and prospect of Islamic liberalism, political liberalism. And what is liberalism there? It's the neutral state, a state that is neutral towards religion in its laws, which would be, I think, it would be a full complement to the whole idea of Islamic democracy, because there is this concern that Islamic democracy or Muslim democracy, when Islamists are in power, turn illiberal. But his emphasis on the neutral state as a positive good, which he defines as Islamic liberalism, is interesting. Of course, there will still be the question, if it's a neutral state and Muslims appreciate that, what is the role of Islam? So what Islam brings? So what makes Islamic movement different than others? That's a new, I think, interesting area we should, people who are interested in the topic should look into. What are the values of Islam? How are they articulated in the modern world without any coercive measures of the state, but accepting a neutrality of the state, but still, what do you what do you advocate? What kind of policy you advocate? So that would be a new, I think, area to discuss. But I believe Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi already opened many avenues in Islamic thought. And I think that's why his contribution is significant. It's a shame that he's in a jail in Tunisia, unlawfully jailed just being an opposition leader by the tyranny that is unfortunately has grasped Tunisia in the past few years. I hope to see Tunisia free again and Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi free again too.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. Andrew, would you like to make some comments or answer the question that he had about, Islamic liberalism and the role of the state in, versus Islamic values? What does it mean to be an Islamic party? And, what are the policies that you're advocating if you are an Islamic party?
Yes. So this is, first of all, it's a major area of ambiguity and ambivalence when you speak with him. So I'm not familiar with a point in which he's himself used the phrase Islamic liberalism or endorsed that as his own view, although I think he wouldn't have a problem saying that there are certain elements of liberalism that he sees as valuable or sees as congruent with Islam, which I think leads us with two observations. One, there are many points in which Ghannouchi does talk about the space for the realization of Islamic substantive aims and perfection and liberation that don't involve the state. So in that sense, there is a kind of congruence with certain ideas of liberalism. So he will mention, for example, various periods in Islamic history, like 9th century Baghdad, in which the state did not impose uniformity on everybody. And there were pockets of philosophers and religious minorities and even atheists, and that the fundamental site of thriving is in civil society. Mosques, education, the family, groups. And so where you ought to see your perfection and your realization is in civil society. On the other hand, this leads us to a certain kind of dilemma, particularly if we are expecting it to look like liberalism, which is to say that moderate Islamic parties have to adopt a relatively pure version of the separation of church and state, or the separation of religion and politics. And so therefore, there's this obsession with, well, are they really moderates? Are they really Democrats? Are they really committed to human rights? And then you get all of these questions about, well, they opposed the inheritance law, or they wanted laws against blasphemy and things like this. And so what I argue, in an article that I've published since this, is that the way we ought to see Muslim democracy in this sense is as post-sovereigntist, agonistic Islamic political thought, which is it's post-sovereigntist in the sense that it doesn't begin with the imaginary that there's a single sovereign community. There's the ummah, there's the people that is already united around its moral views, and so therefore is just applying them in various ways. It begins with disagreement, pluralism, a kind of rough and tumble democracy, and the whole language of sovereignty is not as central. But this is not the same as saying that we all have an agreement about politics as never being able to include religion. It's more like democracy is the space where you can still struggle and fight for your particular views on a majoritarian basis, but you have to obey the rules of democracy. And so that's why, I want to remind people that this is not just an Islamic, recapitulation of certain kinds of liberal theory that say it's wrong to bring in your own views. Rather, it's sort of saying that everybody's going to struggle for their own views. What matters is that you recognize other groups' right to exist and right to exist as political forces, and you conduct that through democratic politics. So that would be the slight kind of clarification or qualification that I would put on Mustafa's sort of comments about Islamic liberalism.
Thank you. Monica, what do you think?
I'm really grateful to Andrew for coming out with this exciting new volume. It comes at a very important time, especially given the fact that the lead author, Ghannouchi himself, has been in prison now for nearly a year. So unfortunately, he doesn't have a way of dialoguing with us in the public space. So Andrew, thank you so much for your work, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I had about 5 different quick points of feedback that Andrew's presentation in this book generated for me. The first is the importance of recognizing the Tunisianness of Ennahda. So many people, when they talk about Ennahda, from Washington, D.C. to Abu Dhabi, they talk about it as if it's just a franchise, like the local McDonald's version of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And it's not, it never has been. And I think the chapter in Andrew and Ghannouchi's book that really highlights that is the chapter on Qutb and Benabi, because you've had that interesting generative tension, that almost dialectic between the two characters. Qutb representing the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and Benabi representing this much more secularly oriented type of Algerian nationalist critique. And Ghannouchi, as a young man, a lot of people don't recognize this, but he had an almost Steinbeckian journey from Damascus to France to Germany to Algeria. And he does all this traveling as a young man, and he toys around with different ideologies, and he's hanging out with Malik Benabi. And Benabi is a huge influence on him, as is Qutb and the Ikhwani thinkers in a different way. But so is the Zaytuna school of thought coming from Tunisia itself. And all of these things are mixing and churning together and influencing not only Ghannouchi, but his age mates and thought mates who create Ennahda in the 1970s. Which brings me to the second point that I think offers some important context here, which is Ennahda has a really unique internal organizational structure vis-a-vis a lot of other so-called Islamist parties. Unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it never cordoned women off into a separate qism, a separate division. There was always mixing between men and women. And unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't founded by one dude who took on a kind of czar-like guidance role. In fact, it was formed by 4 young men, one of whom was Ghannouchi, who were basically age mates in their teens and 20s. And they were in constant debate and dialogue with each other. So debate was a very, very important word for Ennahda's founders from the beginning. And then 2 of those 4 founders, Jorshi and Naifer, they leave early on. And where do they go? They don't leave to defect to the right. They leave to defect to the progressive Islamists. And they stay in conversation with Ghannouchi. So he's having conversations with 2 of the 4 founders who left the movement precisely because they thought that Ghannouchi was too stuck in the Qutb, Ikhwani, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood styles of thinking, and they wanted Ennahda to highlight its Tunisianness more, which importantly influences Ghannouchi's thought, his evolution as a younger person, and the direction of the whole movement. So from the very beginning, in part because of all of these ideological and organizational factors, Ennahda, unlike a lot of other Islamist parties from Morocco to Turkey, wants to be a political party. It doesn't have this Hizb Haraka split that's so common for other Islamist movements. It's basically born political. It's a political animal, and it just wants to be legalized. And secondly, unlike a lot of other so-called Islamist parties in the region, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey's AKP, etc., it's not about justice and development, which are often the key words for Islamist parties. It's about democracy and opposing dictatorship and justice and development. So there's something added there. It's almost like the anti-Bourguiba party. It's these young men who feel so stifled by Bourguiba, along with the post-colonial critique and the more religious critique and everything else. That's a core part of their identity. The third point, when Tunisia goes into democratic transition in 2011, Ghannouchi has been doing all of this thinking for decades and decades that Andrew so beautifully summarizes and that his book so fantastically speaks to. And what's the point of all of that? How does that help or not? Well, I think, and I've seen this play out many, many times in my research in Tunisia since the transition in 2011 began, it gave Ghannouchi and it gave Ennahda more broadly an available democratic library of ideas, or a pro-democracy library of Islamic interpretation to quickly pull off the shelf. And Ghannouchi did that a lot of times, and other figures in Ennahda did that too. Now, sometimes it felt, even to members of Ennahda who I interviewed, a little bit forced, a little bit ex post facto. For example, when Ghannouchi was waffling about whether or not to stand with the lustration law that could have sunk Tunisia's transition by barring his main opponent, including, who was a Sabzi at the time, and his party, Nida Tunis, from standing in the 2014 elections. And Ennahda comes one vote close to passing that law and potentially sinking the democratic transition. And this is more hotly debated inside the party than any of the religious stuff.
Although some people would say that would have been the law that would have guaranteed the democratic transition.
Yes, there was a massive debate about this, a massive debate. Do we want to let our old torturers and their allies and the counter-revolutionaries come back into power? That's how the counter-argument, or the support of that law argument, sounded. Ghannouchi ultimately decides to swing against the law, and it doesn't pass, and he lobbies his caucus to vote against it. And he trots out these kind of ex post facto arguments like, well, the prophet, how did he behave in Medina? He forgave the people who were fighting against early Islam. And I interviewed some members of Ennahda at the time at the base level who said, we feel like we know what he's doing. He's just trying to put lipstick on what we feel is a pig here to an extent. But it's smart. It might not feel right to us, but it feels smart. And there were all sorts of fascinating examples like that, where you saw ideas picked off the shelf at key moments. And that gave the party more ideological flexibility whilst enabling it to keep more of its base on board. Didn't always work. A lot of people in Ennahda left because of that and other decisions. But it was a fascinating process to watch play out. The fourth point out of 5, I'm almost done. I always found it interesting, and Andrew, maybe this is something you could speak to. I always found it fascinating how when I interviewed people in Ennahda after the revolution about whether or not they were reading Ghannouchi before 2011 and after, not many people inside Ennahda were reading Ghannouchi, especially the young people. They were reading a lot of other folks. Sometimes they'd even have read more of like Marx than they'd read of Ghannouchi. Why do you think that is? Some people I spoke to, they said, well, we just feel like his writing was kind of dry, or, it's not a core part of the party's curriculum after 2011. I wonder if you'd come across that or anything. The fifth point, there emerged, as the years went by in Tunisia's decade-long democratic transition between 2011 and 2021, an increasing tension that became obvious to people within Ennahda and outside of Ennahda between Ghannouchi the thinker, Ghannouchi the philosopher, and Ghannouchi the politician, Ghannouchi the suit, Ghannouchi the doer. And there were a lot of people, including inside Ennahda, maybe mostly inside Ennahda, more passionately inside Ennahda than anywhere else, who bristled at Ghannouchi increasingly wanting to wear the politician's suit and wanting more seats of power. And this caused a lot of debate within and outside the party. And a lot of people said, Ya Sheikh, why don't you go write your memoirs or write some more reflections, hang out more with Andrew and contemplate how the democratic transition has changed your ideas over the years. But ultimately, he decided to hop into the political fray. And that was one of the factors. It certainly wasn't one of the top 10 factors, I would argue, but it was a factor that pissed off his opponents and led to, unfortunately, the return of dictatorship that we have today, which of course wasn't Ghannouchi's intention at all, but there was sort of a domino effect that got out of his control, and his leaping into politics was just one factor among many. I wonder, Andrew, if you asked him at all about that. Thanks again so much for an excellent contribution.
Thank you, Monica. Andrew?
Well, I don't want to say too much. I mean, no one has the expertise and knowledge about events in Tunisia between 2011 and 2021 that Monica has. I agree with all of the great things that she says, although I had a tiny observation with Ghannouchi tells the story about how, I think it was already a Nahda, or maybe it was still the Jama'a Islamiyya, sort of became more open to the idea of female integration after visiting Sudan. So I don't know if that's, maybe Radwan knows better about this, but
I
they
never
still
heard
had some of
anyone
that
say that
separation.
after visiting Sudan.
Yes, he says, we went to Sudan with Turabi, and there the Sudanese women were all fully integrated into the party and into the leadership, and this persuaded us that there's no religious basis for this kind of separation. So I don't know. People with better knowledge of the history can speak more about that. I guess I'll say two things. One, very, very interesting point about younger Ennahda activists not reading Ghannouchi. Doesn't fully surprise me. You know, it's a book that, you know, Public Freedoms is a book that I love as a political theorist because there's reading in between the lines. It's very detailed. There's expert discussions of Madison and Montesquieu and Maududi and democratic theory. So it's something that I like very much as a kind of a great work of political philosophy. But I'm not surprised that some young democracy activist isn't going to sit there and curl up with Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. But I would be curious to what extent the ideas kind of trickle down. And so the identity of Ennahda as a democratic movement, or as a movement that's committed to democracy, that's how they see themselves. I'd be curious to what extent that kind of self-understanding filters down, and then to what extent certain kinds of ideas of what that means, what democracy is, and how it relates to Islam, how that kind of trickles down. Really the most interesting question here is how Monica concluded with the distinction between Ghannouchi as a thinker, philosopher, sheikh, but also as an active politician. And on the one hand, it's precisely that combination that makes this book so important and so interesting. Because Ghannouchi, more than any other, you know, Islamist party leader, more than Erdogan, more than anybody that was ever head of the Muslim Brotherhood, had status as a political thinker. And that's partly for being in exile for so long and publishing these books and fatwas. So on the one hand, Ghannouchi is there with people like Qaradawi or Muhammad Salim al-Awwa or other figures in the international Islamic public sphere as defining what an Islamic state is, what is democracy. So he gets his prestige to a large extent as an intellectual, but he gets his importance as a political party leader. And so how to read him is a very interesting interpretive question. And so all these things that he says after 2011, does that have anything to do with Islamic thought? So like Monica said about the lustration law, oh, Muhammad forgave and didn't, you know, okay. So we don't take this that seriously as a moral discourse. It's just putting lipstick on a pig. I don't know what the Tunisian equivalent of that is. Maybe putting barnous on a goat. I don't know. And so, but on the other hand, you know, as students of political thought, this gap between, oh, here's high theory, here's what you really think when you're just in your armchair or in your study, and then here's, you know, a pragmatic and opportunistic political thought, that distinction is not always very sustainable. So, you know, there are schools of thought like the Cambridge School that sees all political philosophy as reacting to its immediate circumstances. Even Hobbes's Leviathan, or Mustafa's favorite, John Locke's letter concerning toleration, or Second Treatise of Government. These are all real world political interventions. So I don't have a statement, but I want to keep that distinction or that combination as a very interesting one. But the other thing I want to say is even high political theory does develop out of real world problems and circumstances. So when Maududi is writing about the Islamic State, nobody's writing about that 50 years earlier. And so even things that we take for granted as exemplars of what Islamists really believe, these are also reactions to real world circumstances. The creation of the modern state, the sovereign bureaucratic administrative state, the reaction to forms of secular education, things like this. And then finally, what I find very interesting is that this real world situation that Ghannouchi is supposedly reacting to, democratic politics with many political parties with deep disagreement, with hatreds, that's not the exception. That's not some kind of like particularity. That is politics. And so one of the interesting things about modern Islamic political thought is it's not always political in that way. So you can read studies published between 1950 and 2010, published by law professors and shuyukh and this and that about, the Islamic State or al-hukm, nizam al-hukm fil Islam, and they have this kind of abstract quality in which it's like they're just talking about Islamic a juridical terminology. But this idea that the actual fact of politics is making coalitions, disagreement, the fact that your view may not be adopted by everybody, this kind of non-moralistic conception of politics, that's real politics. And so if Ghannouchi is responding to that, then it's not going to be the final word, but it tells us something about what Islamist and Islamic and other intellectuals ought to be thinking about. And even if they're thinking about it in a more, they're not looking forward to the next vote in parliament or election, those are some of the questions in which they ought to be seriously thinking about, right? Because you can't just assume that the people is Muslim. When you start voting, things start to look a lot more messy. That fact is very important for thinking about politics. And if you want to claim that Islam does not have the separation of religion and politics, that's a problem that you should be thinking about.
Andrew, one question that I think Monica also alluded to, which is, I think, to me is extremely important these days, is the practicality of accepting the enemies of democracy, the people, the old regime in the new democracy. Have you discussed that at all with Sheikh Rashid, especially in the last few years?
Yeah,
before the coup happened, and was he too lenient with the old regime, in your opinion?
What was his choice? When did he have all of the political power to not be lenient? So you have people like Monsef Marzouki, like the leaders of Tayar al-Mahabba that said we had the chance, we could have seized the democratic revolution and excluded them. I find that very, very idealistic. And you know, it's very easy to forget what 2013 and 14 was like, with the coup in Egypt, with the assassinations, with the cases being filed against Ennahda, this idea that his goal above all else was to prevent a coup, to prevent democratic backsliding, to prevent civil war. Those are not small goals. And reasonable people can wish that the transition had been more democratic, had been more revolutionary, had excluded them. But these are not easy things to accomplish. Even with the agreement with Sebsi, the Ancien regime wanted to fight back. I will say one thing, and this is very interesting for thinking about Ghannouchi as a democratic theorist. When you read Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, the people is everything. How do you ultimately guard against tyranny? Constitutions are not enough. The pious people will never allow tyranny. How do you bring the Sharia back into reality? The scholars are not enough. The pious people in public will deliberate about the Sharia, about maslahah, about public interest, about politics, etc. And so It's a very, very deep theory of the people as the agent who brings about the check against tyranny and morality in public. The last conversation I had with him after the coup, but before his arrest, was, what do you think of as the ultimate check against authoritarianism? And his answer was ittifaq al-nukhab, the agreement of the elites. And so you can see how he'd taken this lesson over 10 years, which is what kept it together. The fact that I could sit in a room with Sebsi or with somebody else and put aside that disagreement and say, how are we going to actually form a government? How are we going to prevent a coup? How are we going to not try to throw each other in jail? And so you can see how he got this lesson that, the real path towards democratic stability is elite bargaining. Elites get together and they're pragmatic and they put aside the worst aspects of politics and they prevent the worst case scenario. And so that, I think, is a very interesting change. And I'm sure something that he had probably had an instinct about before, because as Monica also said, there were those many years of dialogue between Ennahda and other groups in France and London and in Washington, thanks to Radwan and others. And so I'm sure the idea that democracy is made by agreement between parties was there, but it was very startling to me that the way back he saw as about elites being responsible and not taking these reckless, catastrophic decisions. Whether that can be developed into a theory of democracy, probably less important than that as a political lesson about how to actually think about politics in the real world.
Especially in times of transitions to democracy, when you still have very weak institutions and you're relying on those institutions to protect democracy, and perhaps even very weak culture of democracy during that transition. And
as we've learned in America now over the past 8 years, you're always in a transition to democracy. Democracy is never secure. It's never guaranteed. And at the end of the day, even with a constitution that emphasizes checks and balances, at some point, there has to be some vice president that's voting on whether or not to count the votes or not. And so at some point, a culture of elite responsibility seems to matter. And you're always one crisis away from losing a democracy.
Good point. Radwan, last but not least, what do you think about the book, and do you have any questions for Andrew?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, first for the book. And I express also, it's a shame to see Rashid Ghannouchi, 81 years intellectuals, as a thinker behind the bar. It's our responsibility, and I think to get out for him, to get released as soon as possible for not only the Arabs and the Muslims, but for the world to benefit from his ideas and from his theories. I have 3 points. First, actually, we need to go back to the origin of his landmark book, Al-Hurriyat Al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, the public freedoms on an Islamic state. Because the importance of the book, actually, that's what makes the name of Rashid Ghannouchi, not on Tunisia, but also in the Arabic and Islamic world. We know that this book did not came, the debate within the Arab world at that time and the Islamic world was tense, especially after 1924, when Ataturk declared the end of Islamic Khilafah. All the Islamic scholars struggle with the concept, oh, we don't have Khalifa anymore. We don't have a Sultan. and then how the Muslim societies can govern themselves. Then Ali Abdel Razik came with a very critical book called Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm, Islam and the governance issues. And that's received very, very harsh by most of the Muslim scholars, who they come with the term, no, it should be a political theory within Islam. It should be a governance system within Islam. And the debate continue later on. But the main line of especially the Muslim Brotherhood Egypt, which is the main political Islamist movement in the Arab world, they still adopt the notion that Islam is a deen wa dawla, that Islam is not only religion, but also a state. And this slogan always been used in all the election in Egypt, since 1950 till today, that Islam is a deen wa dawla, without having actually definition exactly what that's mean. And this is why most of the Muslim scholars, they come up with this struggle. Then Rashid Ghannouchi came in the 90s to come with this book. I can say he came like a compromise. In one regard, he did not focus on what the Islamic State means, which mean of the Sharia or al-Hudud or apply al-Hudud, or what the concept of the Shura within the Islam is. The Shura mulzima or muallima, that mean the ruler at that time has to obey the consultant council, or just this decision is not obligatory to him. And this is why Rashid Ghannouchi in his book did not come also with the critical into some of the issues like Hukm al-Ridda. This is why he focused more on the issues that let's focus on what we call the concept of freedom within Islam, other than focusing on Sharia or Hudud or other issues which are very controversial within the Islamic thought at that time. Let's focus on the public freedoms, how Islam actually give freedoms of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion. And this is why that the book received very well, especially the book was the first time published by a very known secular publisher at that time, Markaz Dirasat al-Wahda al-Arabiyya, the Center of the Unity Arab Studies. We'd never published any book for any Islamic scholar before. This is why the book received very well in the 90s, especially with the parallel and the debate within, at that time, the failure of or the end of the Islamic movement, especially the case of Sudan, al-Turabi, and the failure to adopt his theory into action into Sudan. And this is why the book, it make a remarkable impact on the Arab and Islamic thought at that time. And then later on, Rashid Ghannouchi was contribute, especially when he was in London, a very famous book at that time, very small, but an important book called, it's a critical, self-critical of the Islamic movement. This is the first time actually an Islamist criticized their action happened before, and they take some responsibility of the impact of their ideas into their action. I met Rashid Ghannouchi the first time in 2005 in London. We've been part of a project at that time called Project on Arab Democracy within the Oxford University. And he came up with, I still remember his question to me. I was presenting the case of the needs of building a ground coalition about the idea of democracy. It's not about being Islamist or secular or Marxist or nationalist. You have to come to coalesce about the idea of democracy. And I still remember his question. He said, how this idea can succeed when we have very extreme leftists and very extreme right, like the case of Tunisia, because everyone knows that the extreme left in Tunisia, it's went to more extreme, not to accept the idea of any kind of grand coalition of other Islamists, as we seen later on in transition in 2010. And then when the Tunisian revolution came into birth in 2010, I believe Rashid Ghannouchi put his ideas into action. Even in many times during this 10 years, he has the vote, but he always to coordinate with others, with this, what they call the seculars, and to build a grand coalition. This is why An-Nahda in the last 10 years, even they came in the election in many times as the first, and they have the majority, even that they never governed by themselves, always relied on other coalition. I think this is exactly the impactful of his ideas into action during the transition. When I met him later on in 2014, 2015, he always believed that this is such, to be able to have a successful transition, you have to build such grand coalition to be able to protect the revolution and protect the idea of democracy. But unfortunately, always there's they never appreciate of others as a Ghannouchi or other Islamic party to be a part of the coalition. And this is why I think this is one of the reasons when Qais Said, he used this political pluralism to hijack the Tunisian revolution and end up into kind of dictatorship, one-man rule. But I will end here by saying that it's important to emphasize that Ghannouchi lived his ideas. Some people believe that Sayyid Qutb, he got the fame within the Arab and Muslim wars because he died and by his ideas, by when Jamal Abdel Nasser, he decided to kill him. And then I believe Rashid Ghannouchi, he lived his ideas. And being in prison today, it's a manifest of how he worked hard to build a notion of dialogue with others, a notion of the need to succeed in a transition of democracy, to be able to have maybe the only successful story. When I asked him in 2014, how we have a coup in Egypt at that time, General Sisi controlled in Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and other countries who witnessed the Arab Spring all ended up to go into a bloody civil war. I tried to ask him how you explain the Tunisian story on this regard. And he answered in one word. He said, we are lucky enough actually to be a small state and lucky enough that no one can interfere in our issues. But unfortunately, that did not protect Tunisia from the failure of the Arab transition, which ended up by domestic struggle rather than actually by outsider factories like in Syria or in Yemen. This is why I think we have to see the history of ideas, how developed with Rashid Ghannouchi. And I'm very glad to see some of his ideas reflected now in English in Andrew book. Thank you.
Thank you, Radwan. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to take few questions from the audience and the participants. So if you can ask questions in Q&A or in chat, or raise your hand, and we will try to come to you, hopefully, if we have time. So the first question by Bill Lawrence. Does Ghannouchi recognize the degree to which his thought is somewhat context-specific to Tunisia or North Africa or the Arab world, perhaps? Or does he see his thought as applicable in very different Muslim and non-Muslim contexts? Does he see his contributions as in dialogue and evolving, or does he see them more as standing and transposable to other contexts and other countries? So that's the first question. We'll take 3 questions together. Farid Hafiz asks, to what extent do you think is Ghanouchi's thought a way of doing pragmatic politics, and in one way rooted in Islamism's preoccupation with the nation state? Is there any hint to more anarchist or fundamental epistemological critiques of the nation state itself? Okay, Jocelyn Cesari, it's not a question, but she says there is a difference between Muslim and Islamic democracy, and I think you alluded to that, Andrew, in your presentation, and you explained the difference between the two. Mustafa Masood asks, I want to raise a question about the concept of sovereignty in current debate as well. It still carries the theological connotation of monopoly of coercion and absolute authority. Does that not go well? That does not go well with democracy and liberalism. How does Ghanouchi deal with this issue? Okay, so can you answer very quickly, Andrew, these
Yeah.
2 or 3
They're all
questions, and we'll take
fantastic
another
and very
round.
theoretically rich questions. First, to Bill's question, the short answer is both. So, and Monica referred to this as well. There's a lot of discussion of el-Khususiyya et Tunisiyya, right? The Tunisian particularity and the Tunisian reform tradition and the Tunisian constitution of 1861. And this is only for us. On the other hand, Ghanouchi, for a long time, was an international public intellectual, visited many, many Islamic countries, and there's lots of interesting discussion of the applicability of Muslim democracy in Malaysia and Indonesia and Turkey. And so I think both iterations of his work, the Islamic democratic iteration in public freedoms in the Islamic State, it's not public freedoms in post-Bourguibist Tunisia. They're very abstract discussions, and Tunisia is put in that context. The end of that book, he surveys all these different contexts, and Tunisia is analyzed as one of them. So the answer is both. He obviously recognizes the legitimacy of a particular Tunisian tradition, but he's speaking to the wider Islamic international public sphere. Fareed's question is really, really smart. If you read Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, and this is why I alluded earlier to loving this book as a political theorist and teaching it in class, the whole book is framed around a critique of Western democracy. Western democracy has a bunch of great mechanisms, tools, devices, love them, but its foundation is unacceptable. And that's precisely what you call an epistemological critique of the nation state. He says that modern Western democracy is built on the idea of the rule of law and the sovereignty of the people, but there's no moral foundation there. It can do whatever it wants, bomb Vietnam, destroy the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea that modern democracy does not have a moral foundation is an epistemological critique that is the framing of his entire book. And then the answer is, why would Islamic democracy be any better? And the entire book, I would argue, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, is how could an Islamic democracy borrow many of the institutions of modern democracy, but provide it with a moral foundation and set of practices that avoids the moral pitfalls and paradoxes of the modern state. So that's the answer to that question. The later work is less so of a critique of the modern state because it's a response to having to do politics within the nation state. And then Professor Masood's question, which I'm delighted to receive. He's been one of my intellectual idols for a long time. That question about sovereignty is precisely the argument of my interpretation of this book. So if you'll let me very quickly just go back to the sharing screen. I'm going to be very brief, Radwan.
Okay,
very, very brief. You'll see here that one of my arguments is that is that Muslim democracy should be seen as post-sovereigntist. It doesn't begin with the idea that you're identifying the single sovereign agent, whether it's God or the people or some combination, that then speaks in a single voice to be able to declare what is legitimate. It begins with the messy fact that the demos, or the people in a democracy, is not morally unified, doesn't speak with a single voice, doesn't have a single sovereign agency. And then how do you think about politics with that reality? So I'm very sympathetic to that question. And in my view, the entire shift from Islamic democracy to Muslim democracy is about getting away from this obsession with sovereignty.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll take three quick questions. First, there is a comment, but I think it's important to read it. Dr. Noor Hayati Ali Assegaf. We have heard a lot about how great Ghannouchi is, and I witnessed how great he is. It will be great if this great people think about how to get this honorable thinker Ghannouchi out from jail. Can we put our effort and network together to free him as our appreciation for this great man? I think that's a call for all of us really to do what we can to, put pressure on the Tunisian regime, on Qais Said, to release him, because he is, of course, old. His health, I heard, is deteriorating in jail. He's already been in jail for over or close to a year. And so we need to really work together to put pressure on Qais Said to release him from jail as soon as possible. So Jocelyn Cesari asks, Ghannouchi is a religious person. So from a religious perspective, the difference between theory and practice or political practice is not positive. Do we know how he himself sees this divide, between theory and practice? And last but not least, Julius Distelov asks, thank you very much for your important book, the event and contributions. How would you explain the current relationship between political practice and political thought within Ennahda? My observation indicates that since Said monopolization of power and the structural containment of Ennahda, there has been a focus on political thought, meta discussions, rather than concrete political measures for Tunisia aimed at shaping the current social, political, and religious structures. So again, it's about the dichotomy between, thought and practice, and what can Ennahda do, or what can Ghannouchi do now to restore democracy? So again, very quickly, and then we're going to take few concluding remarks from the discussants and hopefully end within few minutes. Go ahead, Andrew.
I'd like to say something about Jocelyn's question and then leave the second question to Radwan and Monica. I'm not sure I understand precisely what she means by saying the difference between theory and political practice is not positive. I'm not sure I understand that, but I will say that in an Islamic context, that distinction is very complicated. So Islam is a worldly religion, and so the obligation to take care of the world, to see to the maslahah of people, is a religious obligation, but also a practical one. So as you all know, there are many ways of discussing this disagreement. There are things that are permanently true, issues of creed and theology, morality, virtue, and there are things that are contingent, or there are things that are subject to political reality or to judgment. And so, there's many ways that Islamic political language has for talking about things that are non-negotiable or permanently true, and things that are guided by things that are permanently true, but are constantly subject to contingency, circumstance, judgment. And that's, of course, true for Islamic law as well. There's the distinction between matters of worship and matters of social practice, and even the idea that some matters of social practice might be subject to change based on what is beneficial to the people or not. So the idea that here's religious things and here's not religious things is not something I think that he would necessarily begin by saying.
Thank you. Concluding remarks to the discussants. Any final comments, or we'll start with Mustafa, then Monica and Radwan.
There was a question, what was Erdogan's and his party's view of Ghannouchi's thinking, which can help me say a few more things. I mean, there's respect for Ghannouchi, I think, in Turkey, in all the Islamic circles. But I've heard after the beginning of the coup process in Tunisia and ultimately the jailing of Rashid Ghannouchi, some of Erdogan's hardline supporters wrote that, you see, you need a tough guy like Erdogan. Ghannouchi was too soft, too nice, and you see what they did to him, sort of thing. And I said on top of that, well, so are you proud that you've not been the oppressed, but the oppressors? I mean, you ended up, and the issue is, how do we actually end a zero-sum game in these societies where there are people who have the upper hand and others somehow end up in jail? In Turkey, Turkey's Islamic movement, actually, if you ask me, was unlucky because it didn't have a figure like Ghannouchi. And that's why it began without much theoretical thinking on these issues. Very pragmatically, very moderate, but ended up very Machiavellian and authoritarian. And one more lesson from Turkey is that the belief in the people should be tamed a little bit. The people may love authoritarian leaders, as we see in the West too. And it's important, I think the last point that Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi said, the consensus among the elites, which should ultimately produce what I would call a liberal political framework of government limits and a doctrine of rights that should be the foundation of the state and should be guarded by a judiciary. I think that's very crucial in building democracies as a foundation. And the Sharia may be conforming to that. Sharia might be an expression of that. But I think this emphasis on a bigger universal value, natural law, justice, these, I think, philosophies are important to introduce. And one reason I find Sheikh Ghannouchi's work very valuable is he's also engaging in these discussions.
Thank you. Monica?
Yeah, I'll respond to two of the questions. On the question of where Ennahda's thought currently stands, I think we have to recognize that Ennahda is in a real state of persecution and disarray at the moment. The last time I was inside the Ennahda headquarters was last year, about a year ago, before it was shut down. Kais Saied, a little under a year ago, shut down all of their party offices, along with other parties that he views as threatening. And I was talking with Abdul Karim Harouni, the head of the Shura Council, inside the office, and the windows were drawn, the blinds were down, the lighting was very dim. We were like basically the only people there. There might have been a couple assistants, and on every level.
And you know that Harouni is also in jail now.
That's right. That's right. And I was talking with him and every Ennahda leader I interviewed in those weeks. Are you afraid of being put in prison? And of course, that was a very imminent threat. And within weeks, they were put in prison. And on every level, it just felt like the lights were going out. The lights were going out on Tunisian democracy. The lights were going out on Ennahda's internal organizational structures and conversations for the time being. So I think there's reconstitution work going on right now. Radwan, you would know more about that than I do, but in the darkest days of the Ben Ali period, there was a divide between Ennahda fi Dakhil and Ennahda fi Kharij. And Ennahda in the outside world continued to meet and reflect and produce reports on what they got right and got wrong. And that really helped keep the movement alive in the dark days. And I'm hoping that work is going on like that now, or that planning for work is going on like that. But it's a nightmare right now. And the level of harassment that Ennahda families and even their lawyers, some of their lawyers are in prison too, are being subjected to, and repression across the ideological spectrum is really absolutely terrible. I also, like Mustafa, wanted to briefly respond to Celine's question about the Turkey comparison with AKP, because I think it's really illustrative of how Ennahda sits within a comparative and regional context. I've spent most of my adult life physically and intellectually between Tunisia and Turkey. So I've been obsessed with this question for a long time, for well over a decade. And I wrote an article in the Journal of Democracy a few years ago called something like Tunisia's Islamist and the Turkish Model. That's all about my interviews with AK Party people about what they thought about Ennahda and vice versa. And I've kind of been on personal jihad since about 2015 to try to get them to learn from each other, to try to get Tunisia's Ennahda to learn what not to do from Turkey's democratic backsliding and Erdogan and AKP's role in that, and to try to get AKP to look at Ennahda in Tunisia as something more than a cute little wannabe AK Party cousin, which is how it's tended to view it. I completely agree with what Mustafa said. And just to put another layer of detail on that, in my interviews with AK Party folks as early as 2015 and 2016 about how they viewed Ennahda and how they view Ghannouchi in Turkey, they would say, we have a Rais. We have this strong president, this real tough guy. They have a Hoja. They've got a teacher in Tunisia. And Ghannouchi, he's this cute little teddy bear-like Hoja. But if you really, really want to run the country and you really want to be the model, you don't need a teacher. You don't need a Hoja. You need a Rais. And the way that women would talk in AK Party about simply seeing Erdogan, catching a glimpse of him, shaking his hand, it was as if they were rhapsodizing about a charismatic cult figure. And I never, not once, heard anybody in Ennahda speak that way about Ghannouchi. I mean, in part because Ghannouchi is just not a charismatic bully like Erdogan is, nor does he have Erdogan's illiberal populist instincts. I mean, young people in Ennahda didn't even enjoy reading his books a lot, like Andrew and I were just discussing, for better and worse. So I don't think Ghannouchi ever had that in him. But one thing that did concern me over the years is that I didn't hear enough concern from Ghannouchi and from other figures in Ennahda about Turkey's democratic backsliding. I think AK Party, irregardless of that Rais charismatic bully dictatorial model that they increasingly fell into, remained a model for Ennahda. And I think
he has told me things in private critical of Erdogan.
Yes,
that he's no longer interested in any democratizing project, or no longer really even an Islamic figure. It's only about power and authority for himself. So,
and I've heard some similar things. I think it took too long, but there was that concern. But I still haven't heard inside the folks in AK Party who stayed a learning from Ghannouchi or a learning from Ennahda. There's a lot of AK Party folks who left, more liberals and more intellectuals in AK Party who are now on the outside, who understand that lesson, and will have a very interesting dialogue with you about that.
Radwan, closing remarks in under 1 minute, please.
Yes, I will try. I think I need more. And question of theory and practice, that's really important. And I will be critical here to Rashid and others, because most of the Islamic scholars trying theorizing Islam based on the text of the Quran. And most of them, they ignore the Islamic practice of history, like the idea of democracy and shura. Why it's important here? Because if you read the book of the public freedoms in Islamic State, more theorizing about how freedom, it's a great value of Islam, like justice, great value of Islam. But if you look into the main two countries now, they consider themselves Islamic, like the Saudi Arabia and Iran. They have the worst justice system in the world. This is an important to link the practice with the theory. I think this is why also back to the concept of the Islamic State, how Islam is missing a political system since the beginning. This is why when most of Ali Abdul Razik or others, they argue that there is no Islamic State in Islam, because if you look after the of the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the transition of power was different, from Abu Bakr into Umar, into Uthman, into Ali. And there is no the same system that we can build on. I'm trying now writing a book about how the idea of the Senate, which the Senate means the Shura, was missing in Islamic history. And back to the same idea, how theory always was different than the practice in Islamic history. And I think if we be able to mix those together, can we come up with a theory? It can be, but it always, I appreciate the contribution of Sheikh Rashid into the idea of the public freedoms. And this is because to see the state from that perspective rather than of the perspective of halal, of haram, before him, most of the scholars, they see what the Islamic State they can do and what cannot do. But Rashid Ghannouchi came from different perspective. No, he said, no, this is not the job of the state. The job of the state to offer the freedoms of the individuals. And I think this is an important contribution to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Radwan. I think that in conclusion that we've had a very, very interesting discussion about this this book and really this man, you know, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who is without doubt one of the main thinkers in the Islamic world today about the question of Islam and democracy or freedoms in Islam. So I'd like to conclude by saying that we at CSID are committed to doing everything we can to win his release as soon as possible. So please join us by doing whatever you can in terms of writing articles, writing letters, organizing events, anything you can do at your level or at your wherever you are to help shed light on the great injustice that Sheikh Rashid is going through these days. Please help us. Please do whatever you can to put as much pressure as possible to win his release. It's a big injustice. As to what other Islamists and Islamic thinkers can learn from the Tunisian model, I think that in the first 10 years, we were all very hopeful that Tunisia would be really an important lesson of Islamic democracy for Muslims all over the world. But now it has failed. So I'm not sure that people in the Muslim world right now are learning a lot from that mistake, because they're saying, well, you know, ultimately it failed, you know, so maybe Ghannouchi was too lenient, maybe Ghannouchi was too naive, or Nahda, you know, was too naive. Maybe these ideas are just not practical. So right now, that's why we are in a crisis, because if the most moderate Islamic thinker and the most moderate Islamic movement that gave the most, you know, I mean, tried the most to satisfy all the concerns of the secular parties, the secular thinkers and individuals, really did a lot of compromises and did, you know, unbelievable compromises to try to build this unity around the idea of democracy. If even this failed, if even this, you know, moderate movement and moderate thinker failed and is now ending up in jail, really, what is the message, you know, to the Muslim world and to people who believe in Islam and democracy? Is the message that the West doesn't really care about democracy in the Muslim world and is, you know, will end up supporting dictators and will end up supporting coups against democracy? Is the lesson that, you know, we are not ready for democracy, that the Muslims are not ready because the divide is so big? I mean, ultimately, I remain optimistic. Ultimately, I think that Kais Saied is failing miserably in ruling Tunisia or in solving any of the problems, which Tunisia has a lot of them before the coup and even after the coup. You know, the Kais Saied and one-man rule or one-man dictatorship has not provided the answers, has not provided the solutions that Tunisians fought. You know, they blame democracy for not being able to solve all their problems, but now they're seeing that dictatorship is worse. So ultimately, I think that's an important lesson also to learn, you know, that democracy is not a magic wand, it's not going to solve all the problems overnight, but still is a much, much better alternative than dictatorship.
Radwan,
So-
may I just one sentence there?
Yes,
The Muslim world should be able to have its political experiments and fail and to learn from them and to move forward. I mean, that's how democracy evolved in the West in
Yeah.
a very long time.
yeah,
West
yeah.
was lucky that while this was happening, there was no country coming and bombing them or doing coups within and so on and so forth. So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
experiments were cut short.
Yeah,
It was a great, I think, experiment in Tunisia, what happened. Now it's a downslide, but people will see that this populist who comes and says, I will save you, is not an answer. And that's how we learn. And well, we should just keep up the good ideas, inshallah.
Good point.
And just throw in one more sentence, it's kind of a miracle in some ways that Tunisia's flawed and fragile young democracy lasted as long as it did. It lasted a decade. It
Yeah.
made it 7 years longer than any other Arab Spring attempt. And
Yeah.
Ennahda's concessions and leadership and thought had a lot to do with that. You know, it made mistakes for sure, but
Right.
it also learned. And which lessons did it learn and which lessons didn't it learn? And what does that tell us? I think we should all be studying it. It's very relevant.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that the coup was not just an anti-Ennahda coup. It was against the entire political system.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that it wasn't overdetermined. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't coming from a single predictable sort of counter-revolutionary power like in Egypt or elsewhere. So, you know, with a different president or a different set of circumstances, we could have been having a different conversation about why it's remained such a success story.
Right.
He can't live forever.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Wonderful
Thank you,
discussion.
Andrew, for the beautiful discussion and illuminating discussions. We will post the videos online and we'll send them to you. And please help us and pray for the release of Sheikh Rashid as soon as possible. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.